Last week, we looked at the beginning of Job as Job entered into these times of trial. As on one day, his possessions, his animals, his servants, his 10 children, all gone. Then Satan comes before God and says, well, he didn't curse you because he wasn't afflicted. You can take his stuff away, but you didn't touch him, so that's why he hasn't cursed you. And so this horrible disease befalls Job, all because Satan wanted to prove to God, Satan made the claim that God was not worthy of worship simply for who he was. God was only worthy of worship when he does something. God's only worthy of worship because he blesses, because he protects. And God was proving to Satan that he is worthy of worship, whatever happens, because of who he is. And so the book of Job continues, and for much of the book, Job asks this question, why? Why? Why would the trouble befall him? I mean, he was a righteous man. Why would he lose his stuff? Why would we hear a story like Becky just shared about these missionaries who have their adopted children, children that they love, children they open their home to, children God had called them to adopt? Why would they then be taken away? Each one of us have why stories in our own life. Why would I get this health diagnosis? Why would I lose a child? Why would I lose my job? Why? These questions keep pouring out of us. Why? And so Job has 3 friends who come on the scene. I use that word friend very loosely. You have these guys, and all of them come, and they're Baptists because they say spiritual stuff that doesn't help at all. That's how we know. And so they begin to talk, and they say, well, Job, obviously the reason you're going through this is because there's sin in your life. And each one of the 3, they kind of couch it in different terms, but that's essentially the core of their argument, that bad stuff is happening to Job because there's sin in his life. God is just, God must judge. And here's the thing that's so sinister about these friends is that there is some truth in what they say. There is some truth in what they say about who God is, that God is just. The problem is that they misunderstand God at his very core, because his friends espouse what is often referred to as the retributive principle. That is, not just that good happens, or again, we talked about this a little bit last week, but certainly the Bible speaks of you reap what you sow. It speaks of things like that. But the retributive principle says that good always begets good, and bad always begets bad. That is, if there's bad in your life, it must be because you have done something bad. If there's good in your life, it must of necessity be because you've done something good. And the other problem with this idea is that it confuses, it ignores the spiritual dimensions, and it only looks at the physical dimensions. I mean, we have manifestations of this all over Christian television. If you're sick, it must be because there's sin in your life. If you lost your job, it must be because there's sin in your life. If you want good things to happen, you have to speak good things. You have to sow a seed. You have to do this. You have to do that. And you have all these preachers. Now, here's the problem. Again, they mistake that physical difficulty can sometimes be a spiritual blessing. Sometimes it is a physical problem that ends up being a spiritual blessing in my life. And so they look at good and bad just in physical terms. If you have a financial problem, it must of necessity be bad. If you have a physical problem, it must of necessity be bad. And we have this idea, and Job's friends come along, and Job's friends say, Job, there's something wrong in your life. And Job protests his innocence through the whole book. Now, here's the thing. We cannot forget, as readers of the book, we're let in on something Job doesn't know. We get the prologue. We get the scene in heaven there in Job 1 and Job 2. Job is at no point aware that this has gone on. And Job cries out, God, why? Why is this happening? Tell me what I've done wrong, or declare me innocent. God, tell me what has happened. Tell me why this is happening, or tell me I'm innocent. All my friends are saying that there must be something wrong in my life. And Job cries out, why? And then in chapter 38, God appears. God comes in a whirlwind. Now, here's the thing. Also, let's not forget what happened to Job's children. They were all together at a party, at a birthday party, and a wind came, and a wind caused the house to collapse. It was the wind that killed them, and now God appears in a wind. And Job has cried out for vindication. Job has said, God, give me an answer. God, tell me why this is happening. And God comes, and God appears, and God does not give Job what he asked for. But God gives Job so much more. And I want us to look here at Job 38. We're going to be covering these chapters. We're only going to be reading at the beginning of chapter 38 and the beginning of chapter 42. And kind of summarize the rest. But here's Job, and Job's crying out why, and God comes to him, and God's answer is not what Job asked for. God's answer is not what Job wanted. It's not what Job expected. It's not what he demanded. God comes, and God teaches Job one of the most important lessons in life that any of us can learn, and that is this: God is God, and we are not. That's God's point here. And so we're going to unpack that over these chapters. So look at how God begins his address to Job here in Job chapter 38, verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. So God comes to Job, and God is not saying, Job, here are the answers, here's the why. God says, Job, I'm going to question you. And the first thing we need to understand is that we need to understand our relation to God. A lot of times our accusations of God, our questions of God, they forget our relationship to God. Now listen, Job is declared righteous by God. Job's questioning of God was never called sinful. Job's questioning of God was never rebuked by God. But Job's questioning of God teetered on the brink of accusation against God. And God comes and God answers Job, and we need to see somewhat of what God says here to help us understand our relation. Right, this morning, the refrain through all the songs that we have sung, the choir sang, they all speak of God as our King. And sometimes we forget that this is God in his most primary function is as a king. This is how the Bible from beginning to end addresses God. God is a king, and no more than a servant would be able to walk into the courtroom of a king and make demands and say, King, you need to explain yourself to me. We do not have the right to do that of God. Doesn't mean we can't question. It doesn't mean we can't ask why. But it does mean we cannot accuse God. And a lot of our accusations come because we forget this role that we are the creature, he is the creator. And a lot of our questions of God actually show that we view God as little more than a peer. And so God reminds Job at the very beginning, before God talks to Job, he says, let's get everything in order here. Let's understand our roles. First thing we need to see is that when God speaks to us, it is grace. If you have there in your Bible in verse 1, it says, then the Lord. In most English Bibles, that word Lord is going to be in all caps. It's going to be in all capital letters. And what that means is that it is using the covenant name of God. Right? In Hebrew, you might hear it pronounced as Yahweh a lot. Right? It's using the covenant name of God. This is the first time in the book since the very beginning in the scenes in heaven that that word has been used. And so when God comes to speak, now God is showing himself as this relational God. He is the God who appeared to Moses, the God who made a covenant with the people, the God who invites us into a relationship with him. And when God speaks to Job, the writer is showing us this is an act of grace. God is coming manifest in power. God is coming in this whirlwind, but he is doing so as an act of grace. God does not have to answer Job. God does not have to speak to Job. That God does speak to Job shows how gracious and how merciful God is. Listen to me. God did not have to give us his word. But because he is gracious and because he is loving and because he is merciful, he did. And so often we go through life and we think, why is this happening and what's going on? How can I explain all this? God has given us his word to help us better understand him and how he works. God has given us his word to help us understand the universe. And it is an act of grace that he has done this. A lot of times we treat the Bible as if it's a burden. Well, I have to read my Bible. I have to do this. No, listen, friend. God's Bible, God's word is his gift of kindness to us. And when God addresses us as humans, when God addresses us as broken and sinful people, it is simply because he is a loving, gracious God, and we cannot forget that. But secondly, we cannot know or understand everything about God. This is a big one for us. God says there in verse 2, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? See, again, God is not accusing Job. God is not saying, Job, you've sinned, because later in the book, God is going to vindicate Job. He's going to say, Job has remained blameless. It doesn't mean Job was without sin. It just means Job never cursed God. Job never fell into the trap. Job always worshiped God, even throughout all of his statements. See, there's a difference sometimes between being incorrect and being sinful. And there's a lot of people who our beliefs about God are not sinful. They're just wrong. We don't understand God fully. And that's what God says. Job, who is this who darkens my counsel without knowledge? That is God saying, Job, you're casting aspersions on my actions and you don't know all that I know. It's so funny to me that Henry so often will be insistent on certain things. He'll say, well, that says such and such. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does. He said to me the other day, he goes, you don't know, I know. So I wrote something down. I wrote, you're wrong on a piece of paper. I said, tell me what that says. Well, I can't read. I said, exactly. I mean, he is so sure he is right sometimes. And he went and visited my parents, and my mom went to a store and just got some costumes for the grandkids on clearance. Well, what my mom didn't realize is that she got some Star Wars costumes, and one of the Star Wars costumes she got was a girl's costume. But Mom didn't care. It was on clearance, and that's my mom. So Mom sends us a picture, and there's my nephew dressed as a girl from Star Wars. And I texted Mom, why is Herschel dressed like a girl? And so then Henry comes back. I was like, why were you dressed like a girl? No, Gran said that that's not a girl costume. I'm like, no, it was a girl costume. Your Gran just told you that. No, Dad, you're wrong. Gran's right. Smartphones. I said, hey, bud, look at this picture. See that girl wearing the exact same costume you're wearing here? He was just so insistent that he's right. And so often we're like that with God. God, I've got life figured out better than you do. God, I know things better than you. God, I know what would be best. God, I know what I want. God, I know what would make me satisfied. God, I know what I need more than you do. God, quit telling me what I need. I know what I need. And you hear God going, buddy, this is York's paraphrase, you don't know half what you think you know. He says, who is this who darkens my counsel by words without knowledge? He's like, Job, you're speaking and you have no clue what you're speaking about. Job has boxed in God. Job has said, one of two things are true. Either I have sinned or I am innocent and therefore God is unjust. These are the only two options Job can conceive of. God's going, Job, there's a million more options you've never even thought of. And with our minds sometimes we try and wrap around, and it's not wrong to do that, but when we become insistent on God, when we say, God, I know what is best. God, I know how you're working. God reminds us very graciously and very gently sometimes, but always necessarily, you don't know as much as I know. Listen, if we could know all that God knows, matter of fact, if we could even understand all that God is, we wouldn't need God. But we don't know all that God knows. We don't know all that God is. And we cannot know or understand everything about God. That is to say that when God does stuff, we're not always going to understand it. We're not always going to get the answer to why. And that's okay. But the third thing we need to see is that we need to realize that we are accountable to God. He is not accountable to us. Again, we forget this. God, how dare you? God, how could you? God, why would you do this? I'm a good person. You hear those questions at their core, what they're doing is they're saying, God, make yourself accountable to me. God, explain yourself to me. Sometimes we tie our obedience of God to our understanding of God. Again, I want to keep saying this. It is not wrong to ask God why, but when we tie our obedience to God telling us the answer, then we've crossed into disobedience. God, if you'll just explain why you did this, then it'll be easier for me to follow you. God comes to Job, and you'll notice God does not answer Job. God does not tell Job, Job, hey, listen, at the beginning of all of this, Satan came and Satan made accusations about me, and I knew you were faithful. Job, I knew that you would worship me, and so for the next thousands of years, your story is going to encourage and teach people. Job, that's why this happened. God doesn't say that. God says, put on your belt like a man. I've got questions for you. The language God uses is there in those days, one of the popular sports where it was a thing called belt wrestling, and people would basically put on these big belts and they would just try and wrestle each other down or make the other one submit. Not unlike sumo wrestling. It was a popular thing in the Middle East, and that's what God's doing to Job here. He's saying, let's go. Let's wrestle. You are questioning me. You're making assumptions about me. I have got questions for you. Put on your big boy pants. Let's talk. God is not accusing Job. God is not condemning Job. But God is putting Job in his proper perspective. God is saying, I am God, Job. You are not. You are accountable to me. I am not accountable to you. Please notice, God is not mad, God is not angry, but God is assertive here. God is intimidating here because Job needs to understand before anything else proceeds, God is God, and God is not accountable to Job. So often you hear people say, well, if I was God, I wouldn't do it this way. If I was God, why would he do that? And in all of these ways, though we realize it or not, we try and make God accountable to us. God, you have to explain yourself. God, I can't conceive of what you're doing. I mean, think about it. We say, God, I can't understand what you're doing, so what you're doing must be deficient. Do you hear how arrogant that is? Is it not a possibility that you just can't understand all that God is doing? Is it not a possibility that his ways are higher than your ways, that his thoughts are higher than your thoughts? And so God comes to Job, and before they proceed, God just wants to show Job and remind Job. And don't forget, Job's 3 friends are watching too. So this isn't just for Job. This is for all of them. Who God is. And God is going to overwhelm Job with this realization that God is God and Job is not. And that is not an act of justice. That is an act of grace. Because Job needs to realize that before he can move forward. And so I want us to skip to the end in chapter 42 at the beginning there in verse 1. And I want us to look at Job's response. God will give two speeches to Job, and we're going to kind of glance back at those. But I want us to see Job's response, because Job's response frames everything. It says in verse 1 of chapter 42, "Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful to me that I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. Therefore I despise myself, and am comforted in dust and ashes." Several lessons Job learns. Look there in verse 2. I know that you can do all things. The first lesson Job learns that we need to learn as we let God be God is that we need to be in awe of God's glorious power. Back in chapter 38, God begins these series of questions, showing Job his enormous nature, his infinite person, and his power. He shows that God was like a master builder who laid the earth's foundations there in verses 4 to 7. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. God says, Job, I'm the one that put the world together. I built it. I made it as it is. He said, where were you when this happened? Job, when I put the sockets into the foundations. Again, God is describing this work like he's a master builder. And he's saying, Job, when I did that, there was a whole chorus in heaven celebrating. Where were you? Well, what's Job's obvious answer? Nowhere. God's saying to Job, Job, I made the world. I know how the world works. I'm not only the creator of the world, I'm the one who designed the world. I understand how creation works. Job, I was around before you were around. He was a midwife who brought forth the sea there in verses 8 to 11, who shut in the sea with its doors when it burst out from the womb. When I made clouds its garments and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. So, in the ancient world, one of the pervasive views was that the sea was the elemental, the original element of the world. It was the primary element, and that everything came out of the sea. And so all these creation myths that were in the ancient world, the Ugaritic world, the Babylonian world, all these, whatever God came, he had to come and he had to conquer the chaos of the sea. So again, this is the worldview of Job's day, and God comes along and he says, Job, I didn't have to conquer the sea because I made the sea. I set up the boundaries for the sea. I established where it would go, where it began, and where it would end. Job, the sea obeys me. I'm the one who birthed it. I'm the one who created it. I didn't have to subdue it. I made it. God is showing his power here over all of nature, because in their minds, the most chaotic, the most dangerous thing in nature was the sea. And God's saying, Job, it listens to my voice. I mean, you think of Jesus. Jesus is out there on the boat with the disciples. And Jesus shows that he's God. By how? He speaks and the sea obeys him. All of creation obeys the voice of God. God says, I put limits on it. He says, like a general, he commands the light there in verse 12. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? You think back to Genesis 1. There's darkness and there's nothing, and what does God do? He speaks. And he says, let there be light. And the darkness is overcome by the power of his word. That God speaks, and from nothing there is something. And that every day, God is saying here, every day that exists, every day that happens, every new dawn is because God speaks, because God lets it be. He says, Job, can you just walk outside and say, okay, let's have a new day? Well, Job's answer, of course, is no. But God says that every day is because of Him. Every new morning, every sunrise, the light itself, it's because God spoke it into existence, because God by His Word created. And all these questions are meant to barrage Job with this idea that what can a God like this not do? Isn't that Job's response there in chapter 42? No purpose of yours can be thwarted. So Job understands, Job is reminded here that as we look at God, as we see Him in His glory, and we are reminded of His power, there is nothing that God wants to do that God cannot do. There is no purpose that God has that can be thwarted. If something bad happens in my life, the answer is not, well, God didn't know it was going to happen, or it snuck up on God, or Satan got the best of God. If something happens in my life that's unwanted, God is powerful enough to stop it, and if He has chosen to not stop it, it's because God has a plan. See, as we come, we need to be in awe of the power of God, because so often today, Christians keep taking away from God's power. We keep trying to excuse away things we don't understand by saying, well, God just didn't know. There's a whole branch of theology that sprung up several years ago. A guy, a well-known theologian, his mother died of cancer, and it caused him to begin to reevaluate everything. And his answer to why his mom died was what he realized, or what he came to claim was that, well, God didn't know it was going to happen. Because if God knew it was going to happen, God would stop it from happening. Now, here's the problem. I find far less comfort in a God who does not know what is going on than a God who chooses to not stop certain things that are going on. And Job is reminded here that God is so powerful. God can do anything He pleases. If you are going through a time of suffering, you ought not lose hope, because God is so powerful, God can overcome any suffering you have. Do you think a doctor's diagnosis can stop God? Do you think that there's anything in creation that God can go, well, sorry, Michael, there's just nothing I can do about that. You're on your own. So we ought to be reminded that God is so powerful that nothing in creation, nothing that happens, is beyond His ability to change. And so if God doesn't change it, there must be a reason why. And that brings us to our second point. We need to trust God's perfect wisdom. And Job says there in verse 42, who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me that I did not know. What is Job saying here? God, you've got it figured out and I don't. If God is so powerful that He can do anything, if God is so powerful that even by His word He can conquer darkness, if by His word He commands the sea, if by His word He created the world, if God is so powerful He can do that, then for God to not act points to God's wisdom. And God is going to show Job in these questions there in beginning in chapter 38, that He is like a caretaker who cares for and governs creation. He says to Job there in verse 16, have you been to the depths of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? He says, have you been to these places of darkness? Have you entered the storehouses of snow? Have you seen the storehouses of the hail? God is speaking that He is God over all of creation, from the depths of the sea to the top of the mountain to the sky itself. There is no part of creation that goes beyond God's sight, and God is caring for it all. But then notice what He says, that God is concerned with the things that concern no one else. Now God begins to show Job His wisdom, because look in verse 25. Who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land where no man is, on the desert in which there is no man, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, to make the ground sprout with grass. You hear what God is saying there? God is saying to Job, Job, there are parts of creation where no one is. There are parts of creation where there are no humans. There are parts of the world where no one exists. Only grass. And Job, I make sure that grass grows. Job, I have a plan. You see the language he's using. I have cleft a channel. I have made it rain. I have brought these storms to make sure that the grass that no one will ever see keeps growing. God is so sovereign. God's wisdom is so great that God is at work in parts of the world no one has ever seen and no one will ever see. God is at work over all of this. God cares for all of His creation. He controls the stars. He controls the weather. Then He begins to talk about these animals. He says, Job, I provide food for the lion and the raven. He says, I give the lion something to hunt. And think about this. He says, I provide food for the raven. And do ravens hunt? No. What do ravens eat? What's left over from what the lions ate. God is saying, Job, that the way I've created the world, there's a plan in it. There's a purpose in everything. Job, I've got all these bases covered. He talks about the mountain goat and the wild donkey. Now, mountain goats, nobody goes to the mountain goats. You know why? Because they're in the wilderness. They're in the mountains. Again, they're the parts of creation people don't go to. They see them from a distance. But the donkey was domesticated. And what God is doing here is, Job, I care about these domestic animals. I care about these wild animals. Again, showing Job that whether it's in civilization or in the wilderness, God is caring for these animals. He says, I care for the ox and the ostrich. He talks about the ox. What was the ox's purpose? He says the ox is there to help humanity. Job, I created this animal to serve, to help you all. It helps with the crops. It helps to provide this. And then he talks about the ostrich. Now, what in the world is God talking about an ostrich for? I love what he says about the ostrich. It makes me feel good. Because notice what he says there about the ostrich in verse 13. The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but they are the pinions and plumage of, but are they the pinions and plumage of love? For she leaves her eggs to the earth and lets them be warmed on the ground, forgetting that a foot may crush them, and that the wild beasts may trample them. She deals cruelly with her young as if they were not hers, though her labor be in vain. Yet she has no fear, because God has made her forget wisdom and given her no share in understanding. When she rouses herself to flee, she laughs at the horse and his rider. You hear what God says to Job? I made the ostrich dumb, but I also made it fast. You think about it. God is saying, even this animal that you think has no purpose and has no plan, it's the Forrest Gump of the nature world, right? That here is this animal, and you think, why? This animal, it makes no sense. It doesn't do anything, and the way it acts and it does are so counterintuitive. My grandfather had a cousin that had an ostrich farm in Georgetown, Kentucky. And we used to go, and those birds were nasty. You don't eat them that I know of, and they don't fly. They don't really do anything. But you see what God is telling Job here. But look at what I did. I made this bird that seems to have no purpose and seems to not have much of a clue. I made it fast for protection. God is showing Job, I had a plan in all of this. There's a purpose in everything about my creation. He created the horse. He created these birds of prey. And what God is doing is God is showing Job that the point here is not just his power. God is not focusing on his power like he did initially. Now he's focusing on his wisdom. He's focusing on his plan. And he's showing Job that he is intentional and made each one of these animals for a purpose and made it the way he made it specifically. What God is telling Job is, Job, just look around. I know what I'm doing. I mean, it's amazing to me. We question God. If you knew what I knew, God, if you could just have things figured out like I do. When all around us, all the time, is a reminder that God's got it figured out. God knows what He's talking about. You look at the way that God created. You look at the rotation of the earth. You look at how the moon works with the ocean. You look at the sun and how it causes plants to grow, and how it causes seasons as the earth rotates and the earth moves. God knows what He's doing when He made things the way He made them. And how foolish of me to come before God and insinuate that maybe there is something in His creation that slipped past His wisdom. God, listen, I know you've got the stars and the sun and the earth and all these animals that you created. God, I know you've got all that figured out. But my situation, God, I just think I have a better idea of what needs to happen than you do. God says, Job, I've got this. And God's point to Job is that God did not establish the world to be governed by justice, but by wisdom. See, here's Job's problem. Job wants the primary function of the world to be a world that's fair. This is Job's friend's problems. Bad things happen to me, but I'm not a bad person, so this isn't good. This isn't right. We want a world that we think we want a world that's fair. This is what Job wants. Job wants a world that God governs by justice, that whenever bad things happen, it's because somebody's done something bad. Whenever somebody does something good, they get rewarded for it. They want a world that's fair. That's what they think. But that's not what we want. We don't want a world that's fair. When you are speeding on 44 going to Springfield and you pass a policeman, you pass a state trooper, and you're going 81 miles an hour, you don't pull over to the side of the road, flag the policeman down, and say, "Excuse me, sir, look, I was going 81 and you didn't pull me over, and I just don't think that was fair." We don't want a world to be fair. We just don't want to think we've been slighted. That's the reality. We don't care if we get more than we deserve. We just don't want to feel like we got less than we deserve. And Job and his friends have been making all these statements. I didn't deserve this. I was innocent. This is how God works. And all of their assumptions, they've put God in this box to think that God primarily must do what is fair. And God says, you don't want that. Friend, you don't want life to be fair. A Christian should never complain that life is not fair. We ought to jump up and down and thank God that life is not fair. Listen, I would not have the wife I have if God was fair. I wouldn't have a son like I have if God was fair. God wouldn't give me a church like this if He was fair. If I got what I deserve, I hate to even think of where I'd be and what I'd be doing. And God is telling Job here, Job, you don't want things to be fair. I govern the world in wisdom. You see, God is saying that He cares for all these things out in creation, things we don't even think about. All we think about is us. We don't sit around and complain, oh, God's not being fair to the ostrich. God is not, it's gotten dry over in this desert and the grass isn't. We don't complain about that stuff. We only complain when it happens to us. And God is helping Job see that Job, my existence, Job, what I am doing is so much bigger than you. Our problem is, because naturally, because we are sinful, we are turned so inward that all we think about in life is how things affect us and how they relate to us and how it's going to change things for me. And so we say we want a world that's fair, but we don't want a world that's fair. And God is saying, I'm not giving you a world that's fair. I've given you a world that's good. Here is God's grace, that God in all His wisdom created the universe and created everything in it for good, that He created it with a purpose, that God created it to do what it needs to do and to work the way it needs to work. And God says, you don't want a world where everything is fair because, friend, fair is that when we turn away from God in rejection, fair is us dying. Fair is that the God who gave us life, when we turn away from Him, when we say, I want to live that life for myself, fair is God saying, then you don't deserve to have the life I gave you. That's fair. And God in His wisdom has given us a world that's good. And sometimes that means that things come into our life that are difficult. And sometimes it means things come into our life that we don't understand. And sometimes it means things come into our life that we would not wish for ourselves. But this is where we trust in God's wisdom. You see, because God is perfectly wise, I can always trust in His decision to act or to not act. A world that's fair, what we say we want is God to act whenever I feel there's injustice. But a world that's fair would also mean I don't want, that God should not act when I get what I deserve. That God should not act when things are happening to me that I've brought upon myself. That God should not show grace, that God should not show mercy. Grace and mercy are words that do not belong in a world that's fair. And what God has given us is a world that's good. And so in a world that's good, in a world that's governed by God's wisdom, I can trust in His perfect wisdom for when He chooses to act. Because sometimes things happen in my life and God rescues me, and God lifts me up out of the suffering. But sometimes God leaves me in it. Sometimes God allows it to linger. And I need to trust in His wisdom in those times. And that brings us to the final point, is that our only hope in life is to see God as He is. Job says in verse 5 of chapter 42, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. I love what Job admits here. And Job has not sinned, but Job's saying, I didn't really know you. I didn't really understand all that you are. Job says, I thought I knew. Job says, I thought I had it figured out. I thought I knew how you act. I thought I understood your value system. But God, now I get it. Now I see you. And our only hope in life is seeing God as He is. We turn to other things as our hope. Sometimes we turn to self-righteousness as our hope. There in chapter 40, God says again, dress like, in verse 7, dress for action like a man, and I will question you and make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? See, a lot of times we go through life, and the way that we try and get through life is to just be self-righteous. I will convince myself that I'm better than everybody else, and I'll just be a good person, and I'll do the right things, because if I do the right things, then I will have good things happen to me. And you see what God tells Job is, Job, by you making yourself self-righteous, by you making you right, you are detracting from my glory. You're taking away from me. Job, for you to be right all the time, I have to be wrong. See, we start by comparing ourselves to others, but we go through this phase with self-righteousness where eventually we do what Job does and we compare ourselves to God. Job, he wonders aloud in the book. He doesn't accuse God, but he wonders aloud. If I know that I'm innocent and bad stuff happens, then is God really committed to justice? And this is where it always leaves us. When we're self-righteous, if God doesn't act the way we think He should act, who do we claim is wrong? We claim God's wrong. Something must be deficient with God. He's not doing what I think He should do. He's not acting the way I think He should act. Something must be wrong with Him. And we go through life and just piling on this self-righteousness. We complain about God's acts because we don't think He does what we think He should do. This isn't just about morality. This isn't just about being a good person. But we say, I've heard it my whole life. Well, I can't believe that happened to them. They're a good Christian person. What does that statement really say? That statement really says bad things shouldn't happen to good Christian people. When if you read the Bible, the opposite's true. If a bad thing really happened to Christ, then bad things are going to happen to His followers. If people hated Him, they're going to hate us. If He was a man of sorrow, well acquainted with grief, so will we be. And we go through life in self-righteousness, but that doesn't help. And so then sometimes we try and trust in power. God says to Job, Have you an arm like God? Can you thunder with a voice like His? When self-righteousness doesn't work, we just try and, I'm going to force it and I'm going to make it happen and I'm going to rely on my own strength and my own wisdom and my own power. And God says, Job, even if you had it figured out, if you knew what to do, could you do it? So again, we're always forced to understand the limitations of our power. We get tired, we get sore, we hurt. And yet, we wake up with a bad back and we think that we can fix things that God can't. Again, it just shows how naive and simplistic our thinking can be at times. Complaining is not the answer. God says to Job, adorn yourself with majesty and dignity, clothe yourself with glory and splendor, pour out the overflowings of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together, bind their faces in the world below. Then I will acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you. God says to Job, Job, you can complain about the things in the world. You can complain about the way the world is. But here's the problem with complaining, is complaining doesn't fix anything. You can complain all day, oh, my boss is a jerk. You can complain all day, my wife doesn't love me. But complaining doesn't help. God says, Job, if you just want to complain, if you want to complain about the way things are, then fix it. Oh, wait, you can't. You don't have the power to do that. Here's what God is doing. God is showing Job that we complain God doesn't act. We complain God doesn't fix things. But the reality is we can't fix things. So we are guilty of the same thing we accuse God of. Instead of seeing that our only hope in life is God. And so God does something really strange here. God speaks of these two beasts, Behemoth and Leviathan, and you can read these later. There's a lot of debate about who these are. And basically it's in one of two categories. Either they say that it's a real beast. Almost all commentators will say it's either a hippopotamus to speak of Behemoth or a crocodile to speak of Leviathan, or they'll say it's a mythical beast. Problem is that the way it's described kind of has aspects of both. That the behemoth is spoken of, and certainly there's a lot in there to make you think that it's a hippopotamus, but the word behemoth itself, it's an intensive word. It's actually the word beast in the plural. It's basically God's way of saying the king of the beast. And Leviathan, it's a word that's used already once in Job to speak of evil. It's to speak of sort of this cosmic power of evil. And Job, in the book, speaks of these cosmic powers of evil drawing from other myths. He speaks of Tannin, he speaks of Rahab, both taken from these myths. And I think what God is doing here is God is showing Job something. Because what God is doing is God is using a description of these animals that is very realistic, but also a little elevated, in essence to say to Job, Job, if you got into a fight with a hippopotamus, who's going to win? Hippopotamus. You can't catch one by yourself. If you get in a fight with a crocodile, crocodile's going to win. And if you can't control the earthly beast, then how much more are you helpless against these cosmic powers? These sinful powers of chaos. Again, Job, he has been righteous, but he has been attacked. And what God is doing is God is showing Job, that you don't even have control of the physical realm, let alone the spiritual realm. Job, if you can't even conquer the things you see before you, why in the world would you expect to conquer the spiritual realm and things that are so much greater than you? And he's showing Job is utterly helpless. And now Job says, I thought I knew you, but I didn't. Now I see you. And Job realizes that when we come to see who God is, we do not need to know the why of life. When I see God in His glory, when I get God, when I see God for who He is, when I see God as He is, my focus is not on why God acts. My focus is on worshiping God for who He is. When I see God in all His power and all His glory, when I see that this God has condescended to care for me, when I see how this God governs the world, I realize that why does not need to be given to me in order for me to be content and satisfied in life. That I can trust in God. See, Job ends with God blessing Job. But I think it's often misunderstood. God does not say to Job, okay, Job, you made it through the trial, here's everything back. Because though Job gets his wealth back and Job has new children, it doesn't replace the children that are lost. He lost 10 kids. You think all of a sudden He doesn't care about that? And nowhere does God say, Job, because you were faithful, now I'm giving you everything back. Remember, Job said in Job chapter 1, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And this is God saying, I'm God. Job, I chose to take away from you, now I'm choosing to give to you. It's not because of who you are, anything you've done. It's because I'm God. And Job, as he sees God for who He is, Job now accepts this gift from God. But I want us to see what it says there. As Job closes in verse 6, it says, therefore I despise myself, and in some translations it says repent. But I think the best translation is am comforted in dust and ashes. See, when we are in awe of God's power and trust in His wisdom, then to know Him is enough for contentment. Job says, I'm comforted. If you go back to chapter 2, his friends come to him, and it says they tried to comfort him. They failed miserably at that. And Job, throughout the whole book, has been looking for comfort. He has been seeking comfort. He's been asking all these whys. And now he is comforted. Why is he comforted? Because my eyes have seen you. Here's the thing. When we see God for who He is, when we see God in all His glory, it doesn't matter if we have a lot or we have a little. It doesn't matter if we're going through a time of blessing or a time of suffering. We are content because we realize our hope is not in our circumstance. Our hope is in God. We are comforted, we are content, we are satisfied, not because of what's happening around us, but because of who is in control of us. We are satisfied not because of what happens, and our emotions aren't fluctuating with our circumstances, but our hearts are at rest because God is on the throne. And Job says, God, I see you. And now in humility, I am comforted. And our problem in life so often is that we are not content. And I would argue it's because we don't really see God for who He is. We view God as not giving us all we deserve, or God is keeping something from us, and we don't trust that God is wise. We view it as, why isn't God stopping this? Why hasn't God protected me from this? And we question His power. But when we see that God is able to do anything, and that when He acts or does not act, it is because of His perfect wisdom, only then can I say, God, I'm content. Because wherever I am and whatever I go through, God, You have a purpose in it, and You have a plan in it, and You have gifted me with the opportunity to glorify Your name through it. And in humility, we are comforted. And we need to be a people who let God be God. Instead of saying, God, here's what I think You should do, or God, why haven't You done this? We simply need to worship Him and let God act the way that He knows is best for our good and for His glory. Let's go to God in prayer. Father, Lord, we thank You so much that You are in control and we are not. So often we complain because we think we want to be in control and we think we want to fix things. We don't, because we can't. We don't know all You know, and we don't see all You see. And so, Father, I pray, if there's anyone here this morning who is going through a time of suffering, who's going through this time of asking why, Father, I pray that they would be encouraged in their seeking you. But Father, I pray that they would gently be reminded that you're God. And that's enough for us. Sometimes you graciously show us a glimpse of why, but you're not bound to. You don't have to. And Father, may we trust in you even when we don't understand. May we trust in you even when we cannot see. But God, may we look through the haze of our pain, and may our eyes see you as you are. Father, I pray if there's anyone here this morning and they've never put their faith and their trust in you as Lord and Savior, Father, I pray that this morning they would see that the greatest way you have fixed suffering in the world is by sending an innocent man to die, to take away the penalty of the sin that's the cause of all suffering. That all we have to do is put our faith in him. Father, I pray that this morning they would do that. Lord, however we need to respond, I pray that as we sing this song of invitation, Father, our hearts and our minds are turned towards you, and we celebrate you for who you are. And we honor you for being God. And it's in the name of Christ we pray.